Hello and welcome back to another devlog. This is number 41. Okay, so this week I'm gonna kind of make it quick this week. It's kind of a different week this week. I had a bit of things going on. I actually had a legitimate interview request that I had to attend to on Wednesday. That kind of took my attention away from game development. So I didn't really get the 40 hours in, even though I tried. And so at the beginning of the week, I worked more in Unity, and I did a couple things. I don't think I'll really show or do a demo this week, but basically I worked on the new Biped enemy AI's the enemy AI's rotation and aim. Just polishing it up, got it looking good. I programmed it so the aim is super accurate and would pretty much always hit. I had to write an algorithm that would always hit the player target that it's shooting at like 90% of the time. I had to do an algorithm to kind of take the velocity of the player's movement and the bullet speed and kind of lead the target. So now it hits the player like 90% of the time, and then on top of that I introduced like a variable chance to miss, so it could kind of control how often it actually hit the player, just like I did before with the AI. So let's see here. So I pretty much got the AI working. I reworked the behavior craft and restructured it nicely into enumeration states, and I added patrol functionality. So now the biped patrols just like the other AI, and I added detection functionality, so the AI will detect the player, and then it transitions successfully to the attack state, and then it loses sight of it, and then it goes back to the patrol state. So very pretty much what the other AI does except we're using the behavior graph tree instead of the Invector FSM. And it doesn't have all these fancy other states, like when it loses the target, it'll go do some search and stuff like that. So it's pretty much working as in its basic form. I can always add additional functionality to it later and add more advanced stuff, like taking cover, or but in its basic sense it's a full cycle AI that's working. Everything's looking good. So I added a couple additional things, like it's able to take damage from the player and die. And then the final thing, I was able to, in order to test the enemy taking damage, I fixed up the player aim assist. It was mostly working, but I improved it a little bit. I extended the range and the accuracy, so it's pretty much really easy for the player to lock onto an enemy target. Just little things on Tuesday, and kind of like Wednesday, I was kind of two things. I was sidetracked by the interview. My mind was really focused on the interview, but also I was kind of, at this point, I was kind of coming to another crossroads where it's like, where do I go from here? What's the next step in this project? And I'm kind of like, I was thinking about, starting to construct my levels, and, or, what is I gonna do? I'm gonna do another version of HK that's, like a hunter, like a hunting HK. I'm not sure. So, I kind of did my interview, and then on day 4, I was kind of preoccupied again. I had a visitor, but so I was kind of going around in circles. So I kind of switched back to, game designer mode where you're not really building stuff in Unity, but you're kind of like thinking about, like this here. I have this tiled. You're kind of thinking about overall game design again. And I've been through these iterations, many times before, and kind of going back to the drawing board of a game design, like, the overarching concept of, what are the core concepts of the game you're trying to do, and then zooming more into the actual levels, like how are the levels designed to facilitate that game design, the progression. I have this initial level prototype here, and I pretty much got this by like free flow creation, just throwing stuff at the wall, and I was kind of, I went to Udemy, and I bought this course, kind of like, because I was kind of, I was kind of like looking for ideas mode again. I was kind of like, okay, I kind of want to know what I want to do, but I kind of want to narrow it down. And how do I really apply, like, how can I get the information to, like, really understand the best core game concepts for level design. And while I was doing this, I got kind of sidetracked. I was using I was looking for tools. I was basically looking for a tool on my iPad to kind of replace this application, right? For like a quick way to kind of with your iPad to get your Apple Pencil and really be able to, like, create something like this on your, quickly sketch out, like, level design ideas in an iPad app with your Apple Pencil. The only problem, I couldn't find a application on the iPad that would actually allow you to do something like this, to actually paint with, like, these tiles. I had an application where you could do a grid like this and draw with your pencil and draw straight lines on a grid, but I mean, that could work, but you're not getting all these little, color and details and stuff, like stamping stuff. So I couldn't figure out a way to do exactly something like this, but I could, there's an app called Concepts where you could actually draw, lines in a room. So that's a cool tool. And on the way, I also figured out, some other apps to use. So my original idea was using Blender on the iPad with Sidecar, and while I had that working, it just doesn't really work on that small of a screen with Blender. Blender is too complex of an app, and I could plug it into my app and plug it into my Mac and use Sidecar to do Blender on Mac, but I have to be working on, I have to load the files into the Mac computer instead. And then in order to do it on PC, you have to have a special paid-for app in order to load Blender into the iPad, and it just doesn't really work very good. Doing a screen share of Blender on your iPad. So what I did find, though, I had the things that I wanted to use the iPad for in Blender. What I could do, there's an app called that I bought. It's called it's a sculpting application. So instead of sculpting in Blender and doing it with the mouse and keyboard, you can actually load your model into this app, this sculpting app, and do your sculpting in the iPad app with your Apple Pencil. So I got that, and then also for the process of the process of the next step of painting the model, I have an app called Procreate. So instead of painting in Blender with a mouse and keyboard, what you do, you can import the sculpted model back to Blender and then UV map and then export it to the iPad app, which is Procreate, and that's pretty much like a Photoshop, a great Photoshop application, but it supports painting on 3D models for the albedo, the metallic, and the roughness. So pretty much the major ones that you need to draw for those color maps, right? So there's a whole process, like from beginning to end. I kind of understood. Like you start off with a rough model construction in Blender with reference images, and then you import it to the iPad app, and then you sculpt the details. And then once you sculpt the details, you can go and import it back into Blender, and then you can retopologize, optimize in order to keep the details, but to optimize your mesh, but still keep the details. And from that, you can import it to the Procreate and texture color it, and then back into Blender once it's all textured and colored. And then you can, what you can do, you can duplicate that and decimate that mesh, and then you can bake in the finer details of the retopologized high definition mesh with the color into a low poly model. Then all of that goes, once it's all baked in there, you bake in your normal maps and your detail maps and your painting, and then you can import that into Unity, or then you can rig and animate and then import into Unity, and then in Unity you can add your other things like IK overrides. But that's pretty much the entire process, and that allows me to use my iPad for the parts that are necessary, that it makes sense to use a tool like the pencil for. The only ones you need the pencil are for sculpting and painting, right? And then you can, instead of using the mouse and keyboard. So I have those tools now, and I probably use that. That's great. I'm glad I did the research on that. Things like animation, it's like, mouse and keyboard is probably the preferable way, and using the full application on the PC, But if you just want to, sketch and draw and sculpt, like being able to do that on the iPad, I think it's going to be a great tool. So I figured all that out. That's a sidetrack, but when I get to that, it'll be good to do it that way. So back to level design, the concepts app. I can use my pencil to quickly, draw out boxes with lines, but it's still not as good as this tool when you're, selecting colors and prototyping out basic level design. I still think this tool right here is superior than just drawing lines on. So I have other tools like sketching app if you wanted to sketch out concepts, like custom concepts. I'm not a very good drawer, but that's not really a big thing. Like, I'm not really going to be drawing custom concept art. What the whole thing is really, so in the course he's like, bring up this application that I already had. It's called what's this thing called? It's ProRef or something. Basically, it's just a big board where you can kind of, what I've done here is like, I've gone to sites like Pinterest, and I've kind of pulled down images, and you just, pin them up here of kind of like concept. So instead of going and doing, concept art, you can kind of go and look at these images and be like, yeah, this is kind of aligns and matches with what I'm thinking about for the first level. You kind of, and you kind of use this, like the color schemes and the layout and the kind of design of these, to actually, when you're putting the final paint and polish on your level. So, you know, drawing concept art on your own, that's not really a big thing. You kind of work with other and also I went and did other ones like one for level 2, like what level 2 is going to kind of look like, you know, and things like that. Just kind of did that. So I was going through the Udemy course and and there is information in the Udemy course that kind of gives you like good information. So I'm going to continue to go through this Udemy course just so I get a thorough understanding like of good level design that I can kind of apply, just so I have all my bases covered, so I'm not missing any like, you know, important aspects of my level design that could, you know, I could possibly make it as best as I could. So on Friday, you know, I really got into the weeds of level design and game design, and I kind of go back, you know, to my original concept, and it's like I spent a lot of time like, you know, I was going back to, you know, I was doing what I did before, like looking at these, you know, AAA games, you know, that kind of match what I'm thinking about, like looking at the gameplay of games like, I don't know, Styx, it's like a stealth game, and kind of really trying to, you know, get little ideas and pieces of what you know, how I should structure my, you know, my game features, my game design, and you know, how I should structure my level design, like how I could apply these ideas in my own game. And you know, a lot of these games that I'm referring on, it can apply, but it applies in a different sense, because every game I'm looking at, it's made by a big company. It's like that, you know, really breaking it down and analyzing it, like you know, you can do some of these game mechanics and code, you know, in basic prototype, but the actual game you're looking at, you know, the levels that are created, you can imagine like they have like an army of like, you know, 20 dedicated level environment artists, you know, working on each of the levels, and that's, you know, that's my number one constraint. I'm pretty much constrained by the scope of features, and also mostly is the ability for me to acquire high quality assets from the asset store, like being able to, like, you know, custom, you know, create all these assets for a giant level. Like, it's not going to happen. I have to work in these very small constraints. So it's like I'm trying to take these game ideas with a grain of salt and try to imagine like my game is going to be completely different from these reference games. So I spent a lot of time pondering the universe about my game design and not really getting close to any sort of conclusion, really. It feels like I'm kind of going around in circles. What it kind of felt like at the end was like I'm kind of suffering from writer's block, where it's like I'm kind of like, oh, it's kind of like this circular logic where it's like, oh, I want to get the perfect design, otherwise it's not going to sell, you know. And it's just like researching, like, how do I get the perfect design, you know, and just kind of going around in circles and not really, you know, kind of going round and round and getting writer's block, and like, if I don't come up with the perfect, you know, story to write, it's not going to sell. So I'm just going to sit here and think about coming up with the perfect story. And you really, at the end of the day, you're not getting a lot done. It feels like you're just going around in circles, you know, and you're just ruminating on ideas, you know, and, you know, that can only be useful up to a point. I think eventually what I realized is, so I came to some conclusions though in my, I think, what was it, 2, 3, 4, 5 months ago, I kind of sat down with this game design before, and I was like, okay, thinking about the pros and the cons, and so like, I made the decision to go in this direction, to say I'm gonna go with a VR game only, a VR exclusive game only, right? I had the 3 choices. I had the, the non-VR, the VR hybrid, and then the exclusive VR with the haptic controls. And I said to myself, I want to go VR exclusive for several reasons at the time. I think I talked about it, but I think as I've been going on and my experience, creating the initial level prototype and the camera controls and all that, I really started to see the problems with going all exclusive VR. There's several problems with that. Like, the first problem is, the first major problem, which I kind of understood, is limiting your game's market to VR, people who own VR headsets exclusively, right? So if you're going VR exclusive, that narrows down your market to just people with VR headsets, and that is pretty much like, if you look at the numbers, it's only like, what, like, I don't know, very small portion of the entire game market. So, you're shooting yourself in the foot right off the bat. The second thing is, if you're making a VR game and you're really focused on, I was looking at a game called The Ascent, and it's a top-down, twin-stick shooter, and it looks gorgeous, right? You take a look at the screenshots, and it's like, yeah, that's how I want my game to look, But again, your game is never going to look like that, because the level, they had a game company that had an army of level design or level environment artists, so it looks like $1 million. And my initial thing is like, I could do that as a solo developer, make it look like $1 million for VR, right? And that's not going to happen. It's not going to look half as good as that. My whole thing was like, oh, you're playing in VR and you can look around at the beautiful city or whatever, in VR. But in order to do that, like in order to do something like this, you need a lot of environmental artist resources. Like, I could make it probably look pretty decent with the asset store assets, but doing a custom job, a unique job for every level, just having it look good in VR, that's really not gonna, So the other thing, when I was designing the prototype level, is that the paradigm and the graphical requirements for making something that I envisioned, like something, highly detailed, highly, good looking like this, even if I had an army of level artists, the actual graphical requirements to render all these nice looking things is really a challenge to do in VR. You don't really see a lot of this sort of thing going on. So I really came up against the hardware restraints, even just for basic prototyping in VR, and it's just so much more of a hassle, the budget you have developing a VR only title, where it's like, it's just too restrictive, right? There's just so much more bandwidth when you're narrowing your scope of your render camera to a 2D, top-down 2D sort of thing. So from this point going on forward, I'm really focused on just a basic 2D first. My plan is like, 2D first. You make that game, that's fine enough. And if the game does well, then you support the consoles, then you support Switch Mobile, and then very last, like, you know, then very last, like, you go in and support the VR mode. So it's going to be like a like, you can use VR headset in it, but the game doesn't have exclusive XR controls, and I can't come up with any ideas where exclusive XR controls would be needed. Kind of like Moss, where you're picking up and pulling and moving things in the environment. My game doesn't really say that these things are a requirement. So yeah, essentially exclusive VR is not a requirement. It's like you can use the XR controllers, but you can use the actual controller just as well. That's kind of what I'm going for. But that said, if I want to support the headset in the final version, I have to keep that in mind in order to kind of design my game that I could eventually easily at the end go in and add support for the VR headset, and it wouldn't, my game would be able to handle it. You know what I'm saying? It's like I want to have that as an option at the end, but I really want to just make a game that's mainly focused on the mass market of gamers, which is simple flat screen 2D. That's how I'm gonna work it. So I was like, I have to hit that mark where I can sell a certain number of copies to meet my financial goals. It's like that's the challenge. So in my pondering, I made a few decisions. Like on the core gameplay loop, and basically. So I kind of came to a conclusion. Like, I've thought about this before, but I kind of like a contract of paper of like what I'm trying to go for, like the final revision of the core gameplay elements and how the actual game is going to, like, in prototype, in theory, how the game's going to work. And because you kind of have to make a decision on the game design at this point. It's like, this is how, I've thought about this a whole lot, and I've pretty much decided this is what the core gameplay is going to be, and there's nothing more for it, but I have to execute. So my main conclusion is that just like everything, just like coding, right? You go in there and you try to code your first system and it's terrible, but you don't sit here and ruminate and say, how can I, or go to a course. This can only help so much. You can't go to a course and be like, how can I design the best system? Let me just read from a book. You have to go in and just do it. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to go in there and you have to build a system that sucks, and then you put it to the side, and then you do version 2. You build another system and that sucks a little less, and then you do it again, version 3, and all of a sudden that's better than the last one. You just keep doing it over and over again until eventually you made your 15th, 20th, system that's actually halfway decent, and it's actually professional production level, and it can stand on its own as a foundation. And that's kind of the same thing here. I'm sitting here, I've never designed a game before, I've never designed a level, I've never really made a professional quality art asset in Blender. I've done, amateurish, at a certain level, but in order to get to that level, I can't just sit here and be like, what are the best tools and the best techniques, and, you got to get in there and make something that sucks, and then you put that to the side, and then you do version 2, and then you do it again, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. So I'm starting with these levels. This is the very first pass. You know, throw things at the wall. Very first pass of the level design prototype. Now, I could sit here and be like, oh, this room is not right. Let me fine tune this on paper, and maybe I move this over here, and then, oh, it's just not perfect. This is not perfect. You know, maybe I could do this, and you know, you could go around and around all day. But I think the better idea would be to take this and you start building this in Unity, right? You build a really basic, they white box it out, right? Exactly how this is. And then you stick your character in Unity and you start testing it out to what actually is here, and you see what happens. Oh, I need to add this feature, I need to do this feature. And you get along to a certain point, and let's just say you go all the way and you white box this whole damn thing out in Unity. And it's not the greatest, but now you're on to level 2. You know, this level design, you know, it's probably a shit sandwich, you know what I'm saying? You could probably do, you know, a professional level designer would probably laugh at this and be like, oh, you know, you have this over here, like, oh, this is just, you know, this doesn't flow right, this doesn't feel right, you know, playing this, it's just a sack of garbage, right? And I would agree. It's like kind of me, like, you know, making a professional grade Unity character. It's kind of laughable, but you take this and at least you have a prototype that you can work with and flesh out more ideas in Unity, and it's the first stage. And it sucks, but that's okay. You know, what you do then, you repeat the process. You go on to level 2, and from your mistakes and from your learnings of working with this prototype, you design level 2, and you say what worked about the previous prototype. And then you prototype level 2, which is a slightly better design. It still sucks, but it's a little bit better, you know. And you go all through the game, you know, you do the same process, level 2, level 3, level 4, finish, right? You get to the very level, you have white box level for the entire game, but do you stop there and say, by the time you get to the level 4 or 5, you get to the end level, that's actually, you know, way better than your very first attempt, your very first pre-level. Now, do you stop there and say, oh, it's good enough to ship, I'm going to, you know, I'm going to ship it now that I have all my, or I'm going to, no, what you do, you go back to the beginning, you know, after the experience of, you've got level 5 prototyped, then you come back to the very first level and you look at it, and at that time, you come in with this more experienced eyes and say, I've designed 5 levels at this point, and this first one is the very first level I designed, and it is garbage compared to my most recent one. And you put this first prototype to the side and you redo this very first level with the experience, the context of your most recent level, which is much, much better, level 5. And you go through again, you know, the first level, the second level, you go through another iteration to the whole game until you get it up to that point where, you know, you've gone through maybe the whole game, you know, several passes of design iterations in prototype and white boxing until you get that sense that I've pretty much got this as best as I can get this. There's really nothing more that occurs to me how this can be improved. You know, there's no more, you know, there's no more easy wins. There's no more ideas about how this can be improved further. And at that point, your prototype and your game design, it's all working from start to finish, and then you can apply your production paint, your environmental art to these levels. Same process. First pass, you know, you're doing, it's a different skill. First pass of the from white boxing to level environment art, with the assets you have, it's gonna look pretty garbage, but then you go through all the way to level 5 and then you turn back around and start again on level 1. You do refinement pass until it's at that point where it looks the part where you can't really accomplish anything further. So, and these iterations process, otherwise I'm just going to be sitting here, I can't get started until I have the best design. You're never gonna figure out how to be the best design without making mistakes, and you have to build these things to see the mistakes and what doesn't work, so I have to get started. I can continue to watch. I can watch this for just like the base reference. It's good to have these points of design, these ideas, but this is not going to teach you everything you need to know about the overarching skill of good game design, good level design. It'll give you good points, good pointers, good tips, but it will not, the only knowledge that you earn is, by making mistakes and experience. So I'm just going to have to get started, and I have to accept the fact that it's going to suck. But just like my system coding skill, when I was a junior, it sucked, but now what I can do is pretty respectable, and it's the same thing here with all these other skills. So, yeah, Monday, getting started again. No more thinking about design concepts. We are just going to start, just like this taught you, just throw paint at the wall, just build the damn thing, and start getting your hands on with it. And that's the only way. So that's the plan. Kind of an odd week. No demo this week, no short this week. But we'll continue to do what we do, continue to work on this project. Look at that. I thought it was going to be a short video, but I've gone and rambled on about a lot of different things this week. But I'll just cut it here, and we'll check back with you next week. Thanks for tuning in.